How's it going? On this Independence Day, we're going to have a little bit of a family special video here. This is probably something that many of you may not be terribly interested in, if you like anything about history or biographies, although not of anybody of particular fame. Then stick around. If this is not of interest to you, I thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. But in the meantime, I want to talk about a new member of our family that we have discovered. My sister actually was the person who discovered this bit of information and sent it on to me, and I took it and started digging, which is one of my specialties, and was able to pull up a lot of information. We had previously, on a number of videos, tracked back the family heritage of my family name through time, and we're able to get back to just past the Revolutionary War. If you are interested, here is a playlist of my family videos, and you can look at them or not. This video is probably mainly for family and for future descendants to watch and just to understand where they came from. So we had tracked back through 6 generations: my father, my grandfather, great-grandfather, Oscar, double great J.W., his father Middleton, and back to Jonathan, who was born in Georgia. And we assumed we would never, ever get past him because a lot of the records during the Civil War in locations were burned, along with the courthouses and things. We just assumed there would never be any bit of information ever found out about anybody further back. And lo and behold, my sister just a couple of weeks ago sent me this image of the gravestone of Middleton Brooks. Now, Jonathan's son is named Middleton. Jonathan's father clearly is also named Middleton. Now, at face value, my initial reaction was, is this the same person? Is there some kind of something messed up? And so I clicked on the link where the picture came from. It took us to a website that had the genealogy, and it had Jonathan, who we now know his middle name is Sidney, and then Jonathan's son Middleton. And at that point, it all fell into place exactly who this person was. This is my 7th great-grandfather, Middleton Brooks. So I took the information that I had from my sister and I started digging. One of the things we noticed from the gravestone is that he was a private in the Virginia militia. So now we know where he started from, and we can start digging from there. I started looking in the militia documentation and couldn't find anything at all whatsoever, and was finally able to run across this document, which just opened up the entire story. And basically, this is his pension application in a Georgia court in 1783, just after Congress passed the law on June 7th that enabled Revolutionary War veterans to receive pensions. And this document was his pension application, and it had his history as much as he could provide. So we're going to go through this document and discuss everything we know about him, everything I've been able to dig up in the meantime, and tell his story as much as we can. And it's fascinating. We only know bits and pieces, but for a 6-month period, we know a lot. So Middleton was born in Caroline County in Virginia. He claims his birthday is 1759. He doesn't know the date. That tells us several things. First of all, he probably didn't know his mother and father. It's known that back in the colonial times in Virginia, not many people lived to be even 20 years old, much less to the average lifespan of 40. So it's very likely that he was orphaned at a very young age. Typically, the deaths were due to disease or things like that. So Caroline County, as you can see here, is in northeast Virginia. One of the main ports in Caroline County is Port Royal, as you can see here. Now, Port Royal was established in 1652 and was made a town in 1744. But many of the settlers that came into Virginia came through Port Royal. They landed here during the colonial period and went off into Virginia to do whatever. Now, a lot of the people that came across who were laborer types, who were not connected, who were not wealthy, affluent people, came over as indentured servants, and they worked on the plantations, in the tobacco plantations, because really that's all Virginia was one big tobacco plantation. So a lot of indentured people came over, and they were bound to their master for between 5 to 7 years, and when their time period was up, they were often given clothes, money, tools, land, to start their lives. I don't have any proof or evidence of anything I'm about to say. It's all inference based on the circumstances, the situation, etc. So I'm guessing. But I would highly suspect that Middleton's parents were probably, because they weren't known, were probably indentured servants or laborers on the plantations. They probably died really young. He didn't know them. He knows his birth date based on what he was told by acquaintances. Not his birth date, his birth year. So nobody knows his birth date, not even himself, which I think is terribly sad. So he lived in Caroline County, probably growing up, probably continuing to labor on the plantations, doing whatever. There's no mention of any sort of profession he has. Could, farmer? Well, okay. So he grew up doing that, and at the age of 21 happened to find himself in Halifax, Virginia, Halifax County, which is in southern Virginia, right on the North Carolina line. Now he was there in 1780, which is 4 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, well into the Revolutionary War, but as the Southern campaign was really ramping up. So I'm going to read some stuff from his pension application. These are words straight out of his mouth, and we'll discuss some portions of this, and then discuss the events that happened around it. So, in his statement, he claims he entered the service of the United States in 1780 at the age of 21 when he was drafted in Halifax County, Virginia. By the way, Halifax County was established not too long before then, in 1752, named after the Earl George Montague Dunk, the second Earl of Halifax. Tidbit of information there. We don't know why he was there. Halifax was a major tobacco county, so it's very likely he was there just working. Maybe he had, become proficient at some particular aspect of the trade and was doing that. But we don't really know why he was there. But what we do know is that in 1780, he was drafted into the Virginia militia. Now, back then, being drafted means they walked up and said, hey, you're in the militia now. So he was in the militia. Now, during that time, General Nathaniel Greene, who was very young himself, had been fighting a skirmish war in the South and North Carolina. Basically, he was trying to wear the British down, drawing them away from Charleston, which they had possession of, and fighting a guerrilla war of attrition. Basically, a lot of skirmishes, wearing them down, costing them supplies and men. Because let me tell you, back in those days, when you're fighting a war and having to provide men and supplies across the Atlantic, if you weren't getting them from the population themselves, it's an extraordinarily difficult prospect, and it's why we eventually won the war. But the British were trying to control the South, and if they control the South, they would probably have won. But we had General Greene down there harrying them, fighting his war, and ultimately able to control all of South Carolina except for Charleston, which basically was the beginning of the end, I would say, of the Revolutionary War. But during this time, there was a time where Nathaniel Greene was in a retreat action, drawing Cornwallis's army into the interior of North Carolina, and basically was trying to get to Virginia and cross the Dan River before Cornwallis could catch him. And they were in a race, and they were actually on parallel roads, almost side by side, but Cornwallis couldn't come across to get him because they would have then got out ahead. And so they were trying to catch them and meet them at the Dan. And Cornwallis believed if he destroyed Greene there, he might have won the war, and it very likely is true. So, but Nathaniel Greene had the foresight to know that they needed to cross the Dan, and if they could do that, then they were going to get away. So he had sent some men ahead, and it had pre-positioned a bunch of ferries, Boyd's Ferry and Irvine's Ferry, both across the Dan River, which is sort of basically the border of North Carolina and Virginia along that county. The crossing of the Dan was a brilliant tactical maneuver, and it was carried out, as I said, at Irvine's and Boyd's Ferries in Virginia on February 13th and 14th in 1781. A lot of history written about that. If you look up here, I will put a link to a very interesting video about the crossing of the Dan. I don't want to recreate stuff that's already been really well done, and this is really, really well done. So if you want to look at that, you'll get a great idea of what this was all about. But this is kind of where Middleton's story starts, and we're going to pick it up here. Now, quoting from his testimonial, I will read it to you. Upon being drafted into the Virginia militia, Middleton was assigned to guard the Army's magazine in South Boston at Boyd's Ferry on the Dan River. Now, if you don't know what a magazine is, it's typically a stockpile of weapons, explosives, black powder, food, other supplies for the military. So he was one of 12 men set to guard these stores. And it's corroborated in another document I found on the website that details this particular incident. And this document says that in the fall of 1780, Colonel Boyd, notice the name Boyd's Ferry, Colonel Boyd, probably not the same person, but the same family, influential in the county, Commandant of the Halifax County Militia, appointed James Irvine, Jr. Notice the name, Irvine, Irvine's Ferry. Probably clearly known to each other as family acquaintances for their similar standing in the community. Appointed James Irvine, Jr., a sergeant, and gave him command of 12 men at the magazine, a storehouse for military supplies and clothing, at Boyd's Ferry on the Dan River. Okay? That cannot be anything other than where Middleton was assigned. Irvine took charge of the magazine on November 1st, 1780, and guarded it until about the middle of February, 1781, when Cornwallis had driven General Greene from North Carolina and pursued him to the Dan River near South Boston, Virginia. General Greene noted the danger and urged Sergeant Irvine to get the supplies out of reach, whereupon Sergeant Irvine took the supplies out of the magazine, placed them on 5 wagons, and sent them off to Halifax Courthouse. Okay, that is the official story at the Dan River Halifax Historical Society's homepage. Here's Middleton's deposition. He says he remained at Boyd's Ferry until the approach of Lord Cornwallis's army in February 1781, which rendered it necessary to remove the military stores contained in the magazine. which was done by removing it in wagons, first to Halifax Courthouse, from thence to Charlotte Courthouse, and from thence to Prince Edward Courthouse, where it left the retreat of Cornwallis back into North Carolina, rendering it unnecessary to move it anymore. Clearly, almost an exact recounting of what we heard in the other documentation. Middleton then states that during this period he served 3 months for which he never received any discharge, as he never afterwards saw Colonel Peter Rogers, the officer whose regiment he was attached when drafted, and does not recollect his captain's name. All right, but there's more. So as soon as this tour was completed, he was called upon to serve another 3 months. He was attached to the company of Captain Edmund King, which formed a part of a battalion commanded by Major Hugh Rose, under whose command he was placed on his arrival at Salisbury, North Carolina. So he had moved down here to Salisbury, North Carolina. Not moved personally, but as part of probably the military contingent had moved down there. Along with him, 800 members from Halifax and the surrounding counties had joined the 1,428 members of the American Army and joined Greene's Southern campaign at that point. Now, Greene fought a number of battles as he continued to harry the Brits in South Carolina. But at some point, Cornwallis had retreated and moved down to Wilmington, North Carolina. And when he did that, he left the road open for Greene to begin the American reconquest of South Carolina. So during this campaign, there were a number of skirmishes. He had one substantial defeat just north of Camden against Lord Rawdon, R-A-W-D-O-N. That was in late April, and then he traversed over here to a town called 96. And from May 22nd to June 19, 1781, Greene led a siege on that town. Now, at 96, the reason it was named 96, there's a lot of folk tales about why it was named 96. Supposedly it was 96 miles from the Indian major town there. There's a lot of different things, but basically he laid siege to 96 because he was trying to recover and claim the interior of the South, forcing the British back to the coast and having the main part of the interior remain loyal to the colonialists. So he laid siege to this. Now, 96 was a trading post, a town, but they had built there an earthen star-shaped fort. This is what it looked like. And he had, I think, in the neighborhood of 550 troops there, well armed, well provisioned. He didn't, he had access to the town, and so they holed up there, and General Greene laid siege to them. Now, there's another very, very well done video right here. I'll put the card if you're interested in the siege of 96. It goes into great detail. So Middleton was there as a private, and probably the role he played there, one of the big things they tried to do was they were digging trenches. They were trying to sap underneath the walls of the fort and put black powder there and blow it up. So I would guess you had a number of type of people who were in the army there. You probably had the regular fighters, known, drilled, disciplined fighters, probably some type of Marine or excursionary troops, cavalry. But then you had the folks who had to cook, dig latrines, dig the trenches, forage for firewood. That's probably the kind of stuff that Middleton did there. He was not a hero in the war, but he played his part. He was there doing what a private would do. General Rawdon started advancing with his troops to relieve the 550 British troops that were at the fort, forcing Greene to withdraw and abandoned the siege. And basically they retreated, the standard skirmishing type retreat, to the high hills of Santee, which is northwest of Charleston, southeast of Camden. That area there, you can see it on the map here. And it was at this point where Middleton's service came up. He was done. He was formally discharged from his service at the high hills of Santee and was given, along with some other men, I assume he wasn't on this alone, the charge of returning some British prisoners back to Virginia. And so they left off to do that. And on the way there, Middleton got sick. And so they had to go off without him while he had to stop and recover. So that was the extent of Middleton's service, his 6 months in the Continental Army. But this was something he was extraordinarily proud of his entire life. When the option came up for the pension, he applied for it in 1832. When he passed, as you can see in his gravestone, he wanted to make sure it was known that he was a private in the American Army, one of the Continental Line. If you put something like that on your gravestone, that's what you want to be remembered for. He was extraordinarily proud of that. We have a sense of pride in our family that has been passed down forever, a pride of American history. And we're talking now, if you include myself and my kid, 10 generations of Americans that we can say have served this nation. All of us. So we're very, very proud of that. Now, there's a few bits more of information we have about Middleton. So his military service ended after that 6 months, and we suspect he returned to Virginia. He got married about 6 years later. Now this is interesting. We don't know anything about those 6 years, but when he was 27, he married Sarah Sally Smith. She was 15 years old. She was from Virginia. We don't have a marriage record, but we know a couple of things are very likely. That's not early for a woman to be married in those days. So there's a few things we can infer from this. Either he married her in Virginia, and I'm going to reveal something, he ended up moving to Georgia. So either he married her in Virginia at that age, and you have to consider what type of person was he and she. She's a young girl, clearly. So a family typically is not going to let a daughter go off and marry just anybody. They're going to want to marry somebody who is established, has some sort of trade, income, will be taken care of, respectable. We don't know anything about Middleton to know that any of these things were true. So, did the family allow her to marry a respectable, established man? Or did they fall in love and maybe she was established and wealthy and fell in love with the genetically handsome Brooks, which is another thing that's been passed down all these generations? Fell for him and they eloped because they're married and in Georgia in the same year. So did they get married and move? Did they elope to Georgia? Or did he move to Georgia and met her down there and she just coincidentally had also been born in Virginia? None of these do we know. I would say it's, one of the three. They eloped. Not whether or not she's well off or common. We don't know that. She was allowed to be married. Or he moved down and met her afterwards. None of these we know for a fact. However, we do know that she was 15, he was 27. And they moved to Georgia in 1786 and settled in Wilkes County. And then after that moved to Jackson. Jonathan was born that same year. We know Jonathan's middle name now. It's Sidney. I love that. So Jonathan was born 29th of January 1786. in Appling, Columbia County, Georgia. All right, so now in 1786, they're in Georgia. We don't know anything more about him or his story other than that he lived there and he died there. Sarah Sally passed away in 1825 at the age of 53. Middleton would have been 65 at that point. Middleton ended up living till the 16th of November, 1851. He was 92 when he passed. That's crazy. That is so old back then. It's unbelievable. But he outlived her by about 35 years, sadly. So he passed in Jefferson, Georgia, in Jackson County. And both he and Sarah Sally are buried in the Brooks Story Family Cemetery in Pendergrass, Georgia. So, that's what we know about Middleton the First. It's a fascinating story. I'm grateful, so grateful for my sister for sending this to me and allowing me to start digging enough to pull up all this information, because it's fascinating and it does give us our tie to the Revolutionary War, the colonialists. I always knew we were true Americans. We've known that forever. But it's great to have that little extra feather in your cap. He was in the Army for 6 months. He didn't do anything heroic or spectacular, but he served. And he served on the right side, in my opinion. Anyway. So that's all I have. For my future family members, I hope you find this interesting. For anybody else, I hope you found it interesting as well. But I wish you all a happy 4th of July, happy Independence Day, and we'll see you next time. Pretty sure we're not going to have any more revelations, sadly. But I'm grateful, so grateful for this one. All right. You guys take it easy, and we'll see you later.